What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is the first time you are listening to this podcast, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I think today will be an interesting topic that you'll enjoy, and hopefully you'll continue listening to future episodes moving forward. Today's topic is all about tapering. So a lot of our previous episodes have talked about different topics that are designed to enhance performance, whether it's through manipulating certain training variables, like when we've talked about periodization in the past, or other type of like ergogenic substances that you could take and the effects that those have on your sports performance. But when it comes to tapering it can be a rather complex topic, much like other topics like periodization, in the sense that there's a lot that goes into it and there's a lot of different variables to think about. But the goal of this podcast is to really just talk about some of the science behind tapering and to try and dilute some of that science down so that there's just a few key things that we're talking about with tapering. Because with tapering, there's, like I said, a lot of different variables at play, but there's really only a few different variables that you need to be concerned with. And we have a lot of science now over recent decades that suggests what tends to work best for tapering. That's where the science piece of the taper comes in. And then the art of the taper is what we'll discuss a little bit more towards the end of the podcast. But that's something that's a little bit more up to the coach or the athlete based on their experiences or their best practices, and how they want to adjust some of the more finer tuned details of the taper. So the taper is both an art and a science. We're going to talk a little bit about the science first. And another word that is often thrown around that's synonymous with tapering is called peaking. So if you work with a coach and you go through a taper phase or a peaking phase, usually that peaking phase is synonymous with tapering. Usually the goal of tapering or peaking is to, as the word peaking would suggest, to get you to peak. To reach your physical peak for a specific event. So we're going to dive into the science first of tapering or peaking, but before we get there, let's first illustrate how fitness and fatigue function physiologically in the body, because we need to understand how fitness is gained over time, and also how fitness is accrued as a consequence of fitness being gained, so that we can understand why the taper is so vital for the endurance athlete. And now tapering is normally, it depends on the priority that an athlete is placing on an event. So typically in like the endurance realm, at least with myself and a lot of other coaches that I know and other athletes that I've worked with, we typically operate on like an ABC scale or priority, or an A, B, and C prioritization of races, with A races being like your key 1 or 2 races of the year. B races might be a high priority race, but you're not necessarily peaking specifically for that event. And then a C race can be thought of as like quote unquote a training race, although I don't necessarily like to use races as training days because I just don't think the two blend together very well. And it kind of defeats the purpose of a race. But anyways, a C race would be the lowest priority race in terms of that tiering system. So tapering might be more relevant for something that's a very high priority key race of the year, like an A race or a B race. Whereas if it's a C race, you might just be training up until the day before race day, and then you might go and race and obviously do your best and practice the things that you want to practice come race day. But then you might hop right back into training like a day or two later. So tapering is all relative to the priority that you're placing upon the race that you're going into. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about tapering today, because it's not necessarily like you have to follow a specific taper for every single race. It depends on how well you want to do in that race, how much emphasis you might put on tapering. All right, so first let's dive into the role that fitness and fatigue play, and then how that will eventually lead into why a taper is so important. So when we go about our normal training, let's say we're going about training as an endurance athlete throughout the year, and we've just come off like an end of season break and we're getting back into training. As you get back into training and you move through like your base phase and then eventually into like a build phase, you're going to accumulate fatigue. So fatigue is the acute consequence of a training session. Obviously, easier training sessions won't elicit quite as high of a fatigue response as like a really hard training session will. So a 30-minute, really, really easy bike ride is gonna elicit very little fatigue that follows for the next day or two. Whereas if you go out and you do like a really hard track workout that lasts for an hour and you feel totally spent afterwards, that residual fatigue might carry forward with you for like maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, depending on how intense the session was. And now fatigue is cumulative in the sense that the more you train, the greater your training volume and the greater your training intensity, the more fatigue you accumulate. Now, obviously, you don't want to accumulate so much fatigue that your body breaks down and you begin to move backwards, which would be like an overtraining state. But fatigue is a good thing in the sense that you need to accumulate a certain amount of fatigue in order to elicit changes long term. Those changes would be an improvement in fitness or an increase in fitness. And when I say fitness, fitness here is just a very, very general term. There's obviously a lot of ways to measure fitness. You could measure fitness by assessing your functional threshold power. You could do a graded exercise test and assess your VO2 max. You could assess your 1 minute power on the bike or your 1 mile running time or your 1,000-yard swim time. All those are just different ways of putting a number to fitness. But fitness is obviously multifactorial, and it isn't just comprised of just your functional threshold power or just your VO2 max. It encompasses all those things and a lot more. So when I say the word fitness, just think of fitness in terms of like the very general sense of fitness. So as you accumulate fatigue, you're obviously developing more fitness, and that's a good thing. Now, we obviously want to try and maximize the amount of fitness that we build leading into some of our more important races. So those might be like a key A race for the year or maybe a slightly lower priority B race. We want to be very fit and we want to have the highest fitness possible. Now, a consequence of having the highest fitness possible is that we also have a lot of fatigue. And now this is where tapering or peaking comes into play. So the goal of tapering isn't necessarily just to completely rest and do absolutely nothing. That's kind of one misconception. There might be some athletes out there that think in order to taper and rest up for a race, they just kind of kick their feet up, kick back, and just do absolutely nothing leading into race day. And this is going to be counterproductive, and I'll get into why here in a second. But we also don't want to continue training really, really hard into race day because there are some athletes and this might be more ego-driven than it is logic-driven, but there are some athletes who just want to keep training really hard and with a really high volume right up to race day because they feel like they need that extra training stimulus. But the one thing with fitness is it's a very chronic response to training. So when you do a hard training session, you're actually less fit the moment you're done with that training session than you were before it. And that's because you've now accumulated so much fatigue throughout that training session that your fitness actually takes a little bit of a nosedive. But the super compensation response to that is that in the long term, you get fitter. So essentially, maximizing your potential as an athlete is all about like trying to find that right balance and kind of and depending on how competitive you want to be, but riding that like knife edge of accumulating just enough fatigue that you're not overdoing it. And that you're constantly seeing long-term improvements in fitness without obviously doing so much that you're going overboard and you're moving yourself into an overtraining state. Because if you do too little, you're not going to get any fitter, but if you do too much, you're also not going to get fitter because you're going to be overtraining yourself and burning yourself out. So it's about finding that right balance. And so fitness is the chronic response to training, whereas fatigue is the very acute response to training. So fatigue is almost instantaneous. If you've ever done a hard workout, which most of you listening probably have, you obviously know that if you were to try and go do another hard workout later in the day, or sometimes even the next day, it's very difficult to do so because you are fatigued, you're tired. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's only bad if you do that too much and too often. Now, chronically what happens is you get fitter from that fatigue and from that training stimulus. But it takes weeks, if not months, to realize that. So athletes who are training really, really hard the week of a race, expecting that they're going to see that fitness that they're hoping to get from that session show up on race day, are just misguided because it takes a lot longer to realize the fitness from that training session then just a few days or even a week. It happens 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks down the line is when you'll start to realize that fitness. So fitness is just the accumulation of all that training stimulus over time. Now, when it comes to getting ready for a key event, like I said, that's where tapering and peaking comes into play. So now, as we start to talk about tapering, now that we understand a little bit more about how fitness and fatigue functions, it'll kind of help put into context why the taper is so important, especially for those key events. Now, luckily, there's been a lot of research over the past few decades that have explored this topic of tapering among study subjects. And so we have a good amount of data over the past couple decades that we can start to look at systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized control trials that have been done. And for anyone who's listened to this podcast, I tend to mention meta-analyses or systematic reviews often because that's usually what I like to turn to, because it gives you a nice synthesis of essentially all that we know. And so it's essentially a compilation of a bunch of different randomized control trials that have been done, and then someone basically looks at all of what's been done and then comes to conclusions, whether it's quantitatively or qualitatively, as to what the science is telling us, essentially. And so we have that, luckily, for the tapering literature that's out there. So we have a pretty good idea of what works in general for a taper. But like I said, it's both a science and an art. So we have some science to back up some of the specifics as to what we should do and what the general framework of a taper ideally should look like. But then there's also the art component to it as well, which I'm going to get a little bit more into further on down the line in this podcast. So we'll start with the science first. And so essentially, when you think of a taper leading into competition, there's 4 variables that we can manipulate. And these are the same 4 variables, or most of these variables. 3 of them are the 3 main variables that you manipulate most often in training. So we have training volume, training intensity, training frequency, right? Those are the same 3 variables that you manipulate day to day, week to week, month to month in a normal training plan. You're constantly changing and fluctuating how much volume you're doing, what the intensity is looking like, and then how often you're training each week or each month. So you have those 3 variables, but then you also have the duration of the taper, and that's another key one too. So these are the 4 different variables that we can manipulate when it comes to a taper. So let's say 2 weeks out from a competition, what do you do if, let's say, your training has gone really well leading up to that competition and it's a key race that you want to peak for? So how do you manipulate those 4 variables to maximize your potential when you show up on race day? And that's where we have a lot of science to back up exactly what we should be doing with these 4 variables. So now that we know those 4 variables, we can start to talk about some of the different types of tapers before we get into what the actual science says, because we have those 4 different variables that we can manipulate, but we can manipulate them in slightly different ways. And this is where the different types of tapers comes into play. So there's typically 3 of them. So I'll go through them one by one. So first we have the step taper. And just like a step taper would kind of allude to, it's basically like a massive drop down, kind of like you're taking a step off of, say, a flight of stairs. It's a big, immediate, and sudden reduction in training volume down to a level that remains constant leading up to race day. So let's just use the example of a triathlete, and let's say they're getting ready for their biggest Ironman race of the year, and they built up to, say, their highest training volume was a few weeks at 20 hours a week, just to make it a nice round number. A step taper might be an immediate reduction of going from 20 hours a week to 10 hours a week leading into race day, and it just goes from 20 hours a week to 10 hours a week for the last 3 weeks leading into race day. That would be an example of a step taper. Then we have an exponential taper, which is a little bit more of like a linear taper in the sense that the training volume reduces over time leading up to race day. We have slow decay and fast decay exponential tapers. And so a fast decay exponential taper would be a much larger reduction in training volume at first within the first week, and then that reduction in training volume kind of slowly tapers off those last couple weeks leading into race day. So let's say an Ironman triathlete built up to 20 hours a week. They might go down to 12 hours a week in the first week, and then and let's just say they're doing a 3-week taper. They go down to 12 hours that first week of the taper, then 11, and then 10, or 12, 10, and 8, depending on how much volume they want to reduce. So you see that first week, they see a much bigger drop in volume than they did in the last couple weeks. And then we have a slow decay taper, which is kind of the opposite of that. It's a much slower exponential taper in terms of the rate of reduction of training volume. And then the third category is a linear taper. And this is the one that most people are probably familiar with. It's the simplest approach. It's the most straightforward and the most common. Let's just use that same example of a 20-hour-a-week Ironman athlete. So they might go from, and let's say again that they're doing a 3-week taper and their goal is to get down to, say, like 8 hours a week of training for their last week leading into race day. So they have 12 hours to drop leading into that third week. So if they peak at 20, then they might go down to 16 and then 12 and then 8. So it's a very progressive and linear reduction in training volume leading up to race day. So those are the 3 different types of tapers. And now those tapers are primarily concerned with manipulating the volume. So there's not really much discussion of training intensity or training frequency or how long the taper is. Those 3 types of tapers are really just concerned with how one goes about reducing the training volume. So now let's talk about what some of the science suggests is not only the best type of taper, but also what the makeup of that taper should look like in terms of, should we prioritize a reduction in training volume or a reduction in training intensity? Should we be training less frequently? Should we keep our frequency the same? Should we be training more frequently? And then how long should the taper last? Like how many days or weeks? So that's where we have a lot of good science to back up how we should manipulate those 4 different variables. And then again, which type of taper might be best. And so we have a pretty, it's actually not too recent, it's back from the mid-2000s, but there's a really nice meta-analysis that was done back in 2007 that tried to answer these exact questions. Like, what does the science suggest is, quote-unquote, the optimal taper prescription leading into a competition, like a key competition or race day? So essentially, what should a taper look like? Now, these researchers talked about the kind of percentage improvement in performance that one can expect from a well-executed taper. And it's anywhere in the range of 0 to 6%. Again, depending on the athlete, there are obviously some who respond really well, some who don't respond quite as well. So some athletes might not necessarily see a dramatic improvement in their performance from a well-executed taper, and so that's why there's such a large range. But in general, most athletes can expect to see a 2 to 3% improvement in their performance on race day or during that key event compared to not tapering. Now, this doesn't sound like very much. And if you're like brand new to endurance sport, you tend to see improvements at a much faster rate than someone who's been doing it for 10 years. So a 2 to 3% improvement in performance might be what you see just by training harder for 1 month. But that's because you have a lot more room to improve. But as you start to get further and further in endurance sport, those little percentage point improvements in performance start to become a lot harder to come by. And when you put it in that context, a 2 to 3% improvement is massive, especially at like the elite level. So elite level swimming is a really good example of this. So if you've ever watched like a 100-meter swim race or even like a 1,500-meter swim race, normally it's won or lost by like seconds or sometimes even milliseconds. So a 2 to 3% improvement in performance on, say, like a 1,500-meter swim amongst elite swimmers could legitimately make all the difference between literally first place and last place. Or first place or getting on the podium and not getting on the podium. And the same can be said too for a lot of other endurance events. There are even some triathlons, especially like the short course draft legal triathlons, that are often won and lost by seconds, like handfuls of seconds. And that's, again, just like 1-2% improvement can make the difference right there. And even nowadays that it's becoming more competitive, long distance triathlons and marathons and half marathons are often, again, won and lost with seconds and minutes. And that's all just percentage point improvements here and there. So a taper can make all the difference, especially the more competitive you get. So if you're just trying to like complete a race, a taper is obviously important because you want to feel fresh and rested come race day. But you might be less concerned with the percentage improvement in your performance. You might just want to make sure that you're feeling good and you're not carrying too much fatigue with you. But as you get more and more competitive, the taper starts to become a very real thing that you want to make sure you get right, because it could make all the difference between like getting on the podium in your age group versus not. Or if you're trying to go for like an overall win, getting the overall win or coming third, depending on how competitive the race is. So the taper is just as important as other pieces of your training plan. But again, we want to make sure we're executing it right, and that's where we have the science to back up some of the decisions that we make. So in terms of which variables we should manipulate and which ones we should prioritize, this meta-analysis answered those questions. So some of the key findings that came from this paper were a decrease in training volume tends to demonstrate the largest effects on performance when you compare that with a reduction in training intensity or frequency. So typically we emphasize manipulating training volume over training intensity or frequency. So typically it's the training volume that decreases, whereas the training intensity or frequency stays about the same. You might slightly decrease the intensity or the frequency, but it's the training volume that tends to make the most difference. So by dropping that training volume, you tend to shed the most fatigue, and therefore you tend to feel the best come race day. And so we have a lot of research to back that up. And so this leads us to one of the first variables, training volume, being the prime area of focus in terms of what we're reducing and manipulating. Whereas training intensity or frequency, not so much. That might stay the same. Now, duration of the taper, 8 to 14 days tends to yield the largest effect on performance. Again, this is all coming from a meta-analysis that's quantitatively analyzing all these studies that's been done. And it comes out with 8 to 14 days tends to yield the largest effect on performance. So shorter tapers tend to produce lesser effects on performance, and then longer tapers than 14 days also tends to produce lesser effects on performance. So 8 to 14 days, or roughly 1 to 2 weeks, tends to be the sweet spot. And then in terms of which type of taper to select, again, going back to that step taper versus exponential versus linear taper, both of them, or all three of those, tend to be effective. So it doesn't necessarily matter which one of those you choose, so long as you're reducing the training volume appropriately and that the duration of the taper isn't too short or too long. Any of those tapers can work, but the progressive type of tapers, linear and exponential tapers, tend to work best. And this was basically, this is purely based on the fact that, at least in this specific meta-analysis, that the progressive tapers were statistically significant in having a small effect on performance. Whereas the step taper had a small effect on performance, but when looked at it statistically, it wasn't significant. But both of them did have small effects on performance, so it's kind of a little bit of a gray area right there. But in general, the progressive tapers, it seems, work slightly better than the step tapers. Now, when it comes to decreasing the training volume, how much do we decrease the training volume? So research tends to suggest that reducing training volume over the course of the taper or the peaking period by about 40 to 60% of your highest training volume weeks tends to be ideal, and that produces the largest effect on performance come race day or key competition. And this one stood out clearly in this meta-analysis. So anything less than that tended to yield less than optimal performance improvement, and anything more than that tended to be too much and also yielded less than optimal performance improvement. So, for example, if you are an Ironman distance athlete and you peaked at 20 hours a week, you would ideally want to be aiming for, in your last week of the taper leading up to race week, somewhere around like 8 to 10 hours a week that you drop down to. If you go from 20 hours a week, dropping down to 2 hours a week during your last week of taper, that might be too much training volume reduction. And so you might not get as good of a performance on race day as you would have if you had done slightly more training volume. Same can be said for not dropping it enough. So if you go from 20 hours a week to only 18 hours a week during your last week of the taper, that's still a lot of training leading into race day, and you're again going to have less than optimal results come race day, at least based on what the science tends to suggest here. So reducing training volume over the course of your taper down to about 40 to 60% of your peak training volume tends to be best. And then we know that keeping training intensity and training frequency the same also tends to be best. So you're not necessarily cutting out all training intensity. And this is another misconception with a taper too. A lot of athletes will think that they just don't do any intensity whatsoever, like you just do none. So you drop the training volume, but you also don't do any intensity, and everything you do is easy. So that also seems to be slightly counterproductive in the sense that you're not going to yield as good of a performance on race day as you would if you had kept in your training intensity. And usually it just so happens that leading into a key race, most of your intensity anyways is very race specific. And that also serves as like kind of a sharpening mechanism in the sense that it keeps you sharp for race day. So you're not feeling flat and sluggish when trying to go out there and do race pace intensity if you haven't done race pace intensity for the past couple weeks because you just cut all intensity out of your training. So dropping the volume but keeping the intensity there is key. And also maintaining the frequency is key as well. It might drop slightly because you're doing less training volume. But if you're training, let's say you're a runner and you're running 6 times a week with one off day, if you all of a sudden go from running 6 days a week to running twice a week to achieve your reduced training volume, that's not ideal. You just want to reduce the duration of each training session, but keep the frequency the same. So the stimulus in terms of frequency and intensity is the same, but the volume of each session or the duration of each session is a little bit less. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room here. You might be able to drop like a session or 2 each week, and it's probably not going to have that big of an effect on your performance. But I think the key takeaway there with frequency is that you don't want to drastically reduce it. So if you're training 6 days a week as a runner at your peak, and then you go into the taper phase and you say, instead of running 6 times a week, I'm running 5 times a week, and all 5 of those training sessions are a little bit shorter, then that's probably just fine. But if you're going from 6 runs a week to 3, that's probably a little bit too much. And then again, 8 to 14 days of the taper tends to be best, with those progressive type tapers tending to be best over the step taper. But again, on the type of taper, that's where the consensus or the literature wasn't quite as clear cut in this meta-analysis. So it seems that the step or the exponential or the linear taper can work so long as those other variables are manipulated appropriately. So that's the science piece of it. That's where we've had decades of research compiled into a meta-analysis that's suggested that these tend to be how we should manipulate training variables in a taper or peaking phase to achieve the best results possible. Now, the art piece of it is what comes next. So now that we know what the general framework should look like, which is a step taper, exponential taper, or linear taper can all work, but the type of taper might be slightly less important so long as we achieve a training reduction or a training volume reduction of about 40 to 60% while keeping intensity and frequency the same, and the duration of that taper is about 1 to 2 weeks. That's the general framework that we know tends to work best based on what the research literature tells us. It doesn't necessarily say, though, what the specific training sessions should look like and the order of those training sessions and the specific prescription of each of those individual training sessions. That's where the art comes in. And this is where a lot of the psychological component of the taper comes into play too, with not only the coach but the athlete. Because some athletes, the taper period is very mental, it's very psychological. And this is where you build a lot of confidence for race day, is in the taper. You want the athlete to feel very confident going into race day that their taper period was just right. It wasn't too little, it wasn't too much, there wasn't too much training intensity, there wasn't too little. They still feel like they got enough training stimulus in that they feel psychologically and mentally confident going into race day, because confidence is obviously huge for an athlete. And now this is where a lot more of that art starts to come into play. So we have that general framework established with the different variables and how we manipulate them, but the day-to-day sessions is very much so up to the coach or the athlete and how they want to choose to structure their taper. So let's use another example just so we can illustrate this concept and we can kind of put all these pieces together. So let's say we have a triathlete. Let's go back to that Ironman triathlon example. So we have a triathlete who's peaking for their key Ironman race of the year. Let's say they went through their big base phase of the year, and then they went through their build phase, and then their key race of the year is at the very end of the season for them, which is like, let's say October or November. So they've had all year to train for it and build up for it, and then they've had a long build phase leading into this race. Their last month or so of training, they had like 19 to 20 hour weeks of training for the last few weeks. Now what do they do when it comes to taper time or peaking time? So we have the science to back up some of the variables that we manipulate and how we manipulate them. So the general framework for this athlete, and this is just a very generic athlete, so generically if I was looking at this athlete, I would go, okay, so they peaked at 20 hours a week. The goal might be to get them down to, say, 8 or 9 hours of training in their last week. And we know that their taper is going to be about 2 weeks long. Now, when it comes to some of the ultra endurance stuff, I've seen tapers as long as 3 weeks, and that might be necessary if the athlete has accumulated a ton of fatigue. So for athletes who do a lot of training volume and a lot of training intensity, which tends to come, more so the volume, tends to come with ultra endurance sports like Ironman triathlons and like 100-mile trail runs or 100K trail runs, those types of events. In special circumstances, a 3-week or even like a 2.5-week taper might be needed to get the right amount of, or the right duration of the taper so that they're shedding enough fatigue come race day. And this is where certain platforms like Training Peaks and other platforms like that can help you like visually see how their fatigue and their fitness is changing over time. But that's neither here nor there for this particular podcast. The point is just that it doesn't have to be exactly 1 to 2 weeks. You have a little bit of wiggle room on both ends. But to keep it simple for this example, we're going to have that Ironman distance triathlete who peaked at 20 hours a week. We're going to get them down to 8 hours a week of training over the course of a 2-week taper. We're primarily reducing their training volume, keeping the training intensity the same, keeping the training frequency the same, maybe knocking off a session each week. And that taper is lasting, again, 2 weeks. So if we choose, say, a linear taper for simplicity, they might go from 20 hours a week at their peak down to 14 hours a week during their first week of taper, and then down to 8 hours a week that last week of their taper leading into race day. So they went from 20 hours a week, they cut that down to 14 and then 8, right? So they had 12 hours of training volume to cut to get down to their 8 hours a week of training. So we just took half that in the first week, got down to 14, and then cut down another 6 hours, which is the second half of that, and got down to 8. So that's a good example of a linear taper. So that's where the science backs up all of what we've just done. That would fall very much in line with what the evidence tends to suggest would work best for that athlete leading into race day. Now, the art comes in where we're designing the specific day-to-day sessions and what those sessions look like. So for this specific athlete, most of what they've probably had been doing over the past couple months is race-specific intensity. Maybe a little bit of intensity that's not race-specific. That's just to kind of keep certain aspects of their fitness or their quote-unquote engine like revved up and tuned up. But most of it's focused on race pace intensity, which in this case would be Ironman-specific intensity. And so most of the intensity that they would keep in those sessions is their race-specific or Ironman-specific intensity. And then, like I said, their frequency is staying the same. So how the coach or the athlete decides to set up those individual sessions is up to them. There's not really science to suggest, oh, there's a very specific protocol that you have to follow. And it all depends on a lot of different factors that are very unique to the athlete as well. So some athletes might like to do certain sessions a week out from, say, their key race, and that just mentally gives them confidence. Whereas other athletes, that type of prescription might completely take away their confidence. It might make them feel terrible about their performance coming up on race day. So you have to take those things into account, what the athlete likes, what makes them feel good, and then also just like any specific travel circumstances that they have to work around. So some athletes might be traveling over like multiple time zones leading into race day or like the week of race day. So that has to be taken into account. Lifestyle has to be taken into account as well. Obviously, how a professional approaches a taper is going to look a lot different than how an amateur approaches a taper, because a professional might not have a full-time job, whereas an amateur might have a full-time job and they might have other commitments on top of it. So all these factors need to be taken into account. And that's where the individual day-to-day sessions are very much so up to the coach and the athlete and how it looks. And so it's kind of up to the coach or the athlete to find what works best within the general framework that we know works best based on what the science tells us. So that general framework might not change very much from one athlete to another, but the specific sessions that each athlete does is going to be very much different. And that's, again, where the art comes into play. So we've covered a lot of the science, and then the art we can't really talk about specifically because that's where it's more so just kind of ambiguous. It's again up to the coach or the athlete to choose and decide which works best. So it's not like during race week for this Ironman distance athlete who's peaking for their event, it's not like they have to do a very specific bike session that does like 3 by 30 minutes at Ironman specific race pace with this amount of recovery and this amount of warm up and this amount of cool down. That's all the art. That's all up to the coach and the athlete and what they feel works best and what gives the athlete the most amount of confidence, what works with their schedule, what works with their travel, so on and so forth. So we've talked about the science and then the art, and that's the taper in a nutshell, right? So it can be a very complex topic, but hopefully this podcast simplified it somewhat in the sense that you have the science piece of the taper and then the art piece of the taper. The science tends to suggest certain things about how we manipulate 4 key variables. That would be training volume, training intensity, training frequency, the duration of the taper, and then that 5th piece of it is the type of the taper. And again, remember that type of taper that you choose is really just determining how you reduce the training volume. So again, it's just those 4 variables: volume, intensity, frequency, and then taper duration. That's the science. We have some science to back up what we do there. And then we have the art side of it, which is where the coach and the athlete decides what their day-to-day looks like of their taper. So there's the taper right there. So hopefully I was able to simplify it somewhat for you to make a complex subject just a little bit simpler to understand. I have a piece that I wrote specifically about the taper in our VO2 Max forum, which is our online blog. So I'll be sure to link that piece into the show notes below so that you can read about what I talked about in this podcast episode. And it talks in just a little bit more depth that meta-analysis that I talked about. It also gives a couple figures and graphs that demonstrates the different types of tapers, as well as covers each of those different training variables and what this meta-analysis suggested was the best approach to take with each of those different training variables. So there's just a little bit more detail in that written piece that you can dive into if you're interested. But hopefully this podcast was able to break down the taper for you and simplify it so that you have a better understanding of what the science suggests is the quote-unquote optimal tapering prescription. And then we obviously had a little bit of a discussion towards the end as to how the art side of it fits in, and how a lot of that is up to you or your coach if you're working with a coach. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to go back into our archive and listen to prior episodes as well. Most of our episodes are focused on a specific topic like this, but as we expand this podcast, I'm starting to introduce some new podcast episodes and mini series within the podcast, so that there's a variety of different types of content. But again, the major focus of this podcast is to help bridge the gap between science and application. So for those of you who weren't as familiar with what the science says about tapering, hopefully this helped illuminate what the science says. Now you can take that science, apply it to your own taper if you're coaching yourself, or to the athletes that you might work with if you're a coach. And so we're hopefully, bridging that gap between the science and then the application of that science in day-to-day practice with athletes and coaches. So again, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you continue to tune in for future episodes. I'm looking forward to the next one with you. Take care. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.